this will be a presentation, as the Italians would say, a quattro mani, so with two speakers instead of one. Hopefully it will be easier for us to answer your questions afterwards. We have two brains as well. My name is Matthias. With my colleague Maria, we form part of the Collections Management Unit of the Archdiocese of Malta. The Collections Management Unit, so we come from the larger island. The Collections Management Unit is responsible for the management of religious materiality, so stuff similar to what you're seeing all around you, in the Archdiocese of Malta's churches. We have 68 parishes. I don't know how many churches that would be, but it's a lot. So this is the work we do, but what we're presenting today is sort of an offshoot of that work. It is a research that we conducted originally to present in Florence as part of a conference dedicated to materiality. With materiality we mean tangible patrimony, no? In this case we're talking about patrimony. And we thought, since we found a lot of information on a topic that is fairly underrepresented, we speak about slavery, mostly in the Maltese context. We rarely speak about those Maltese and Gozo and other Christians who were in captivity in Muslim territories. In our case, we will be discussing North Africa. So we thought, why not present the results of our research at home? And we chose specifically this museum because we really support the work you've been doing through the months. I have had the pleasure to attend a couple of past lectures as well, so I said why not.
Thank you very much for welcoming us. I'll just play the next slide. Bear with me. Okay, perfect. So we would like to start by sharing with you a case study. It is a tangible example of religious materiality. I think it was working. So the painting that we showcase here is actually present in Malta. It is at the parish church of the Holy Cross in Floriana. It forms part of the collection of the Capuchins in Malta. And in fact, Matthias and myself we work also at the 𝐂𝐴𝐵𝐿. And this painting shows Our Lady of Freedom. So this painting is extremely important. It is actually a banner. It used to be a processional banner, and it hails all the way from the bagnios, from the slave prisons in Constantinople. So in this case study, we will start by sharing this narrative where there were a group of Christian captives, mainly Maltese, in the 16th century, who planned one day to escape from the slave prison in Constantinople. They stole a vessel, and they also took with them this processional banner. Why is this important? It was probably the banner within the church in the slave prisons. So just as a brief introduction, the prisons in Constantinople and those in North Africa, they had a prayer space for captives, for Christian captives, where they could exercise to a certain extent their religion. And this was one tangible example, which made its way to Malta. So they took this processional banner, left in haste, and the Turks, well, the Ottomans quickly realized that they were escaping, and they chased them. However, the Christian captives, some of them were Maltese, they were quite familiar, they managed to escape, and as they arrived to St. Paul's Bay, the Ottoman vessels retreated. They were very afraid that the knights would attack, and they decided, in celebration of this very important miracle, they deemed it a miracle, they carried out this procession from St. Paul's Bay up to Floriana, where eventually this marvelous testimony of this miracle is still there present today in the church, was placed in the chapel, and there was a lot of devotion to this miraculous image. Don't know if you have anything to add to this case study. Perfect. So before we move further on to continue our presentation, I would like to discuss some limitations of the study. So most of these religious objects derived from slave bagnios are extant now. So, however, we use textual sources. So the example that I gave you before is very rare. That is why we decided to start with that very interesting story. So we based our research and our presentation on the textual descriptions that we found in actual sources written in the 17th century. And Matthias will also explain in more detail how we managed to access these as well. And we can also, it is very safe to assume that the religious materiality, which was present in the slave manuals, would mimic those that, the objects that were found in churches in Europe. That being said, the captives were in a way encouraged to spend money and also to spend time to create art objects which would be used for their liturgical services. So there was this kind of encouragement also by the jailers, as we will discover further on through the slide. So I will let my colleague also elaborate on this further. I will just have to proceed on to the next.
So, just by way of helping you to situate yourself geographically the places that we're talking about, alright? We will consider 5 banyos. So, banyos are prisons, alright? It's just another word for slave prison. 5 of them in North Africa, Meknes and Fez in Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Those are the documents that we found. They mostly concern these places. It's also the places where typically one would also find Maltese captives, Maltese slaves. Captives and slaves, we're using this term interchangeably. What's the difference? One is French terms, valeur d'usage, and one is valeur d'échange. So one is the slave is something that's more permanent. You are being taken in slavery to work, to row, to work in the fields, to work in construction for an indefinite period. There is little to no hope for redemption. Why? Because this individual possibly would not have the means to pay for his own salvation, for his own redemption, which is different from captive as a term. Even though primary sources, so the original documents, they use both interchangeably as well. However, the captive is somebody typically of a higher social status who could fetch a bigger price and therefore would be set aside immediately for ransom. Okay? Which means that the captor also would help the captive to send letters home to inform his family that now he's in captivity so that they could send money for his ransom. Right? So there is a slight difference. It doesn't mean that these could not end up like these and vice versa. Furthermore, as I said, typically individuals of a higher social status, so knights, academics, priests, monks, they would be immediately pinpointed and placed in a different kind of banyo. So even the banyos were different, even the prisons were different. One was like an open center, we would call it, so it was a prison. At night they're locked in, but during the day, they go out and work. Some of them were even allowed to do like a tiny part-time job where they could earn some money to redeem themselves eventually. It would take years. Whereas the others, already earmarked for ransoming, would be placed in a much stricter, much less free structure for the simple reason that you needed to safeguard their safety. Something could happen to them, and then your investment would go poof. That's it. Right? So ironically, the individuals of a higher social status had much less freedom to move about in a Muslim city than those who were there semi-permanently. That being said, we do have some textual sources of individuals who for some reason try and hide their social status. They would not want their captors to know. So I'm going to read, even in the next few slides, some primary sources for you to get the feel of what this information tells us. 2 of them I will read also in the original language to give you a better feel of what we do as historians when we are in the archives and the interaction with the primary sources. So the source I'm going to discuss now is titled The Religious Slave and His Adventures. So I'm going to read this in English, it's a translation, from 1690 by a French author named Antoine Courtier, and it discusses the capture of a Greek Christian bishop. We're not sure if he was Greek Catholic or Greek Orthodox. However, we know he was a bishop. And I quote, "This prelate considered himself lucky to pass to Tripoli for a simple captive, without birth and without quality. He was employed in the vilest works, such as serving the masons, carrying the filth from the prison, and other jobs which exceeded his strength. But the Christians, touched by the miseries he suffered, and seeing that he would soon succumb under the weight of his chains, they forced him to declare that he was a priest. His declaration was advantageous to the captives, so now his role is going to change as well. So his declaration was advantageous to the captives. He visited the sick, detained in the dungeons, administered the sacraments to them, distributed to them the alms he received from the Christian merchants, consoled the afflicted, and fulfilled all the duties of the priesthood with such fervor and piety that he was no less esteemed by the infidels than by the Christians." Alright, so we're seeing also this primary source is discussing how the captive and the captor interacted between them. And there is a form, which we will discuss sooner, of almost respect between the two at times. This, however, doesn't diminish the fact that slavery or captivity, whichever term you prefer to use, was a really hard situation. It was not as simple as that, and it takes a huge effort for us, after 400 years, to discuss the topic with the sensitivity it deserves. Okay, so if you are taken into slavery, what options do you have? First of all, you have to work, at least if you are considered a slave. But how do you get out of it eventually? You had options. The first option from the 17th century onwards, so slavery is something that exists across cultures, across centuries, all over the world. Alright? It's not something Mediterranean, it's not something European. Almost every civilization, from the Egyptians and even before the Sumerians, had a concept of a human being owning another human being. That is perennial. We're going to focus on the 17th century mostly, so the 1600s. Why? Because in the 1600s, at least in the Maltese case, we start seeing emerge a particular framework. The state is starting to worry about this situation, mostly because, of course, they are escalating what we call the 𝐂𝐴𝐿 wars. These privateers, people who get a license to assist militarily the official navy of the Order of St. John, in our case, with these hit-and-run attacks. So tiny vessels owned by private individuals who get a marquee, who get a license to operate in a part of the Mediterranean. Naturally, that comes with its risks. So this state is creating what we call the Pio Monte della Redenzione, which is a sort of bank, let's call it a bank. Money is deposited in this bank, and it's serving for the redemption of slaves. So if you do not have your own means, you would write to this Pio Monte, which incidentally was set up during the magistracy of Grandmaster 𝐴𝐿, a Frenchman. After a particular contact with the Capuchins, so again we have this link with the Capuchins, particularly this Maltese Capuchin from Dingley, Raffaele Camilleri, who exhorted the state to do something in one of his Lenten sermons. However, they didn't have enough capital. So in comes Caterina Vitale, which is the woman you're seeing here in this lovely painting by Antoine Fabre. This is the bozzetto for the painting. The painting used to be in the church of the Selmun Palace, which belonged to the Pio Monte. And this Caterina Vitale was crucial for putting an injection, a sum of money into the 𝐵𝐻𝐻𝐻. Eventually that money would be invested in property would be rented out indefinitely, and all the proceeds would go towards the redemption of the slaves. So the first tool you have at your disposal is the state. However, there was a limit on how many people the state could redeem. So enter the confraternities, several confraternities. Two of the main ones who were responsible for the redemption of slaves, so you know a confraternity is a brotherhood, typically of men, even though we have female confraternities as well, who come together, pay a membership annually, and that money is used for a cause. So some confraternities console the dying, for instance. Some other confraternities did random acts of charity. These particular confraternities assisted with the redemption of slaves. The Confraternity of Charity in Valletta, tal-Carità, in the Church of St. Paul, Parish of St. Paul, and the Confraternity of the Holy Trinity in 𝐶𝐻𝐵𝐻. So another option could be, especially if you were yourself a member of these confraternities, you could write to these individuals. They would set up a ballot to decide whether you deserved the money or not. So if you're well off, you can't ask money from the confraternity, use your own means. Why take money from somebody who can't afford his own redemption? So they would decide between them who deserves it and who doesn't, and in case you're deemed worthy, you would get the money once you safely manage to reach the shores of Malta. Alright, so they won't just give you the money and then you can escape to wherever. This was particularly because you had cases where individuals were renegades, were not slaves. They had used, or they had taken too many wives, and the Inquisition was chasing after them. They quarreled with someone. So what do? They go to the other side of the fold. Okay, we call them renegades. To ensure that you don't get renegades, you needed to present yourself to the shores of Malta. You would speak to the Inquisitor, of course, to assure him that throughout your years of slavery, you did not apostatize, you did not switch sides, and once that's done, you get the money, and you would send the money to whoever paid for your redemption. So you would be due, you would be owing somebody an amount of money, a large sum of money. Just to show you what these documents look like. So I told you we were going to have a look at some of the primary sources. These are from the 18th century. They're readily available on the HMML website, the Hill Monastic Manuscript Library of the Malta Study Center, and it shows documents conserved nowadays in the archive of the Confraternity of Charity in Valletta, in a fondo called 𝐷𝐴. So this 𝐷𝐴 guy was like Caterina Vitale. He took an amount of money, he put it in a fondazione, a pious foundation, and the money would be used for the redemption of slaves. This here is a passport, a lascia passare. So we're presenting this idea that it was simple for you to just leave the Barbary and reach Malta. We know it was not that simple, and many, even though they managed to get out of slavery, would not eventually reach the islands. Lots of things could happen. So in this case, we have this Fra Luigi da Firenze, who is a Franciscan minor observant, popularly called 𝐸𝐴 in Malta, who is giving an attestation that this particular individual from Malta, Giorgio Salerno, truly remained faithful to the Catholic Church throughout his years of slavery. I'm going to read it in the original vernacular. Noi, Fra Luigi di Firenze della più stretta osservanza di San Francesco della provincia di Toscana, già missionario privilegiato di Costantinopoli, prefetto superiore di Tripoli di Barbaria e parroco presente, salute e pace nel Signore a chi percorra la presente. So he's introducing himself, and he's a missionary, right? He's saying he was a missionary in Constantinople, and he's superior in Tripoli in Barbary. Essendo costume della nostra cancelleria di registrare i nomi, cognomi e patria degli schiavi dimoranti in Tripoli, per osservare se conducono vita corrispondente agli insegnamenti della Santa Madre Chiesa Cattolica e Apostolica Romana. Quindi trovavamo registrato Giorgio Salerno di Malta, so we know they had records, they had registers, and they kept names and provenance of all the states. You're not forgotten when you're in slavery, it's like you're caught and that's it, you're done. Il quale, essendo acquistato schiavo per lo spazio di anni, ha vissuto da buon cattolico ed esecutore di quanto ci prescrive la nostra sacra legge cattolica. Essendo dunque stato riscattato dovendo di qua far partenza per la sua patria, lo raccomandiamo caldamente a ciascheduno per dove passerà. He's saying, now he is being redeemed and he has to go home, and we're asking you that if this guy is presenting himself to you, help him. Okay? He needs your help to reach home. Per tutta l'assistenza in ciò che gli sarà di bisogno nel suo passaggio, eccetera, eccetera. So this is from 1757, however, these are formulaic, so they don't really change from 1600 onward. Another source that we use is this particular letter. Again, they're formulaic, they're not written directly by the slave. You can tell by the handwriting that this is somebody who was erudite, he's an academic. He's probably writing letters for all the slaves in the back, you know. And he is asking in this letter for assistance. Francesco Gelfo dalla 𝐶𝐸𝐵𝐺𝐲, he's from 𝐶𝐸𝐵𝐺𝐲 Isla. Umilissimo servo delle signorie vostre, umilmente le risponde come quelli sono, trovandosi a navigare verso la costa di Mezzogiorno, he's saying exactly where he was, on the southern coast, fu assalito da una galiotta tripolitana e fu preso schiavo dalla retta in Tripoli. Supplica perciò l'innata benignità delle signorie vostre, molto illustri, vogliano degnarsi concedergli l'elemosina, so the charity, he's asking the heads of the confraternity if they are willing to offer him this money for his redemption in charity. L'elemosina solita darsi da questa veneranda confraternita per il riscatto would be in modern Italian, degli poveri schiavi. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of some of the sources we're using. Another font, another set of documents that we use are the documents now conserved in Rome, starting from 1622, so there are no documents before 1622, when the Propaganda Fide, the congregation of the propagation of the faith, was established. What is the congregation of the propagation of the faith? With the Council of Trent, so the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church is looking outward, outside Europe. They lost a lot of territory naturally in mainland Europe due to Protestantism, but now it's a much wider world, it's a larger world. So you have new territories for evangelization, particularly Northern and Southern America and Asia, especially Japan and China. So they're sending missionaries. The religious orders, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, they have been sending missionaries already for a long time. However, it's not centralized. So what the Catholic Church is trying to do with Gregory XV, Ludovisi, Pope Gregory XV, is to centralize this work, this missionary work that is happening all over the world. They produce documents, and we shall see some of them later. They produce documents that explain what the state of religion was in the barbarous states. All right? So these missionaries are going to places where Christians are being held captive, and they are discussing with the Congregation of Propaganda Fide, which also served as a college to train new missionaries. They are discussing what the state of the practice of Catholicism is inside the banyos. And they give us a lot of information on the religious materiality that the captives are using. A third form of primary source are, of course, autobiographies. We don't have many autobiographies. We have one very important one, though, by this guy called Hieronimo Graziano. Hieronimo Graziano is very famous among the Carmelites because he was one of the confessors of Saint Teresa of Avila. He was also the first superior general of the Descalzed Carmelites, the male branch. Amongst other things, I urge you to look him up, Hieronymo Gracian, a very interesting life. Amongst other things, Hieronymo Gracian was also held in captivity for 18 months in Algiers. So we have his own testimony of what happened, and he's saying, I heard the confessions of my captive Christians, possessive of my captive Christians. Of course, he's captive alongside them, but he's feeling the sense of responsibility towards them. Comforting them when they were beaten with a stick, pacifying their quarrels, and visiting them when they were sick. If they wanted to cut somebody's nose or ears, to reprimand them, okay, so this was a form of punishment, I would manage to get forgiveness with a little money which I got faithfully from the same Christians. So again, we're seeing what the role of the priest was among the slaves. Keeping peace, assisting the sick, as we saw with that Greek Christian bishop, and collecting money for the ransom of some, or to bribe the captors.
I will gently navigate because I got stuck again. Apologies for that. So we'll continue our talk today. Here we present you with a question. We're toleration versus tolerance. So throughout our research, when we were reading the articles and also reading Propaganda Fide, primary sources, there is this contrasting notion where the slave, the captive suffers a great deal of hardship. We know that they were sometimes beaten. We know of instances where they were mutilated at times. However, there is also another, let's say, contrasting perhaps this life within the banyo. So after their day, they were also, after their daily chores, they went back to the banyo, and within the banyo they had this church, the church which they could decorate, where they could practice their religion, albeit to a certain extent freely perhaps. They could acquire materials to be able to decorate the churches. They were allowed to practice feasts like the Corpus Christi, and they were also very active during Good Friday. So there is perhaps these contrasting sources which perhaps do not help you imagine perhaps this life within the slave prison. So these, as I wrote here, the first-hand descriptions of these religious practices and the materiality they used within the churches partly suspend in the reader's imagination the visual connotations that we normally associate with captivity, and even, for an instance, present us with a scenario of spiritual freedom. So although the slaves were allowed and to a certain extent encouraged to practice their faith, I pose to you a question. Was this out of perhaps respect, or was this perhaps rather a way to keep them docile, to keep them perhaps calm? We know, for example, that Matthias mentioned Father Hieronymo Gracian, who was central within the ecosystem of the slave banyo, the operation. He provided a spiritual leadership to the captives. So the captives looked up to him. And even though they were experiencing all the suffering, it perhaps helped them emulate Christ. So this religious practice, which we'll delve into in perhaps the next slide, we'll start by some examples. This is an actual quotation by a priest within reporting back in the Propaganda Fide, where he describes that the decoration of the banyo churches during Holy Week is no greater than in any city in Spain. I want you to look at this quote. It's perhaps metaphorical in the sense that the image we have here, it is from an actual altar in the Retablo de la, you know better, it's in Madrid. Matthias has better pronunciation in Spanish, so generally I can do that reading. However, the setup within a church in the slave banyo would not look like this. The materials that they would have been provided with would be, albeit simpler. However, there were craftsmen who were actually encouraged to perhaps decorate the churches in such a way. But what this priest is actually referring to, as he's reporting back, might be also the sentiment that the slaves, that the partakers, that the captives managed to, with their small, albeit very humble materials, they managed to create this almost festive kind of environment within the churches. Perhaps we can change the slide as well. And this is another quite interesting quotation. It's from another source, it's from 𝐍𝐨𝐫𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐻, written by Cervantes, where he shares his sentiments through the character Vivango, where he reflects on his experience, and he says that these faithless dogs, referring to the jailers, let us keep our religion. So once again, we have that question, which we started with. Was it tolerance or toleration? So by providing these captives with a semblance of home, by letting them exercise their faith, by letting them practice their religion, they remained docile. But this was a means to an end. By remaining docile, they got into less trouble, they were less likely to escape, hence they retained their economic value and could be ransomed. And my colleague was also explaining before that there were different types of slaves that fetched different amounts of money. So once again, was this a means to an end? Did they really care about the slave, letting them practice their religion? Another very interesting quote, which ties in back to Father Jerónimo Gracián, who was quite active. The governor of Tunis remarked that no ransom money could ever suffice since he makes his Christians obedient. So this further strengthens our argument that perhaps religion was just a tool, a means to an end, which retained the captive calm, that they were emulating Christ, sharing in his suffering. And once again, pass on the mic to my colleague.
And we said in the beginning that part of the difficulty we encountered is that in the majority of cases, we no longer have this materiality extant. There is no museum in Morocco or Tripoli or Algiers which contains this materiality that the sources are describing. What happened to them, the majority of them are lost to time, with a few exceptions. So this is one interesting exception, a story from a city in Morocco overlooking the Atlantic Ocean called Media. The city of Media, towards the beginning of the 17th century, became a safe haven, a harbor for English Protestant pirates who were using this Moroccan enclave, in a Muslim country that is, to attack Spanish shipping between Seville and the New World. So Spain naturally said we need to take out the south coast. And in 1614 they attack Media, they capture it, and they hold it till 1681. So imagine having a city within a Muslim principality and holding on to it from 1614 to 1681. Eventually in 1681 they succumb to Moroccan forces. And when the Moroccans move in to Media, they don't only capture a large quantity of Christian slaves, okay, they were trapped there was nowhere to go, so they ended up all in slavery basically, which was a huge scandal for the rest of Catholic Europe, all these people taken into slavery at one go. They even take the images, the religious images, and by images we mean both visual, so paintings, and material statues. Okay? One of them is this Christ the Redeemer. It was a Christ the Redeemer originally, commissioned by the Capuchins from Spain and sent over to Media to serve as an item of devotion in the Capuchin Church of Media. Okay? So keep in mind, from 1640 to 1681, the Spanish built churches in Media, and this was one of the statues. All the slaves and the statues and paintings were taken to Meknes, which was originally the capital of the Principality of Morocco. And the population of Meknes, not being able to beat the slaves, we have the idea that slavery is like the banners, on the galley, and they're beating them all day. Naturally, you couldn't, and you shouldn't. Not just because they had the respect for another human being, it's not about that. Because of their economic value, okay? If they die, it's an investment. You killed your investment. So not being able to punish the Christians as a reprisal for all those years that they had done to one of their cities, they took it on the statue. And what you're seeing here, in fact, is from the Casa de Pilatos in Seville. It's an image attributed to �W𝐴, which shows the Nazareno, this image of Christ, being dragged along the streets of Meknes, and people are beating the statue. So the statue of Christ is a stand-in for all the slaves that they took. Eventually, the Mercedarian order, so the Mercedarians, the Trinitarians, they started going around Spanish cities collecting arms to gather a huge sum of money to go and redeem not just these captives, but also the religious images. And they end up paying the weight of the statue in gold. Okay? And this is a wooden statue, so it's not papier-mâché. When it was taken back to Spain, following all this story, there was this idea that Christ is not being represented only as a Nazarene, as a captive of Pontius Pilate. You know the story of the Gospel, no? Christ the captive as part of the Passover story, but Christ as one of the captives that needed redeeming along the other human captives. So instead of the image of Christ the Redeemer, he was transformed into a sort of 𝐂𝐴, okay? The actual title that was given to him was 𝐶hristo-𝐾𝐢𝐵, Christ the captive. And he's represented, tied naturally as a captive, with the pallium, with that sort of scapular that redeemed slaves would wear when they were eventually taken back home. So typically when you managed to redeem a large number of slaves, you took them back to their home city and they would do a procession. And to show everyone that these were redeemed people, they would wear a scapular, 𝐂𝐴𝐵𝐿. And the scapular would have the cross of the Trinitarian order or the Mercedarian order, okay, the symbol of the religious order. This idea of Christ, the captive, was soon taken up by many Spanish cities. So nowadays, if you go to Malaga, if you go to Seville, you go to Madrid, where the original is, Cristo de Medina Celi, okay, you will find all these representations of 𝐶hristo-𝐾𝐢𝐵, Christ the captive. One of these few examples we have where religious materiality that was originally in one of the baños made its way back to Christianity.
Perfect, so we were speaking a lot about...
You prefer this side?
I think so. Yes, it's interesting. So yes, I'm tangled up in a lot of wires there, so it's better this side to avoid any accidents. So yes, religion life in the prisons. As we explained before, the prison complex used to have a space dedicated for a church, a prayer space. This prayer space often had a dedication. So as we see in the slide, we make reference to one of the earliest churches documented in the Baño Grande in Algiers, which was the Iglesia de Santa Cruz, which is the Church of the Holy Cross, where we have other churches as well listed, such as the church dedicated to St. Catherine and St. Roch and the Holy Trinity. This implies that in these churches there was probably a statue which represented the dedication of that particular church. I will further, maybe I should change it. Yeah, I do. And this also implies that within these churches there was also that religious materiality which links to the liturgical service. So within a church, for the church to operate, you'd need, for example, here we are in an ecclesiastical museum setting, so it's perfect for our purpose. You would have items such as a ciborium, you'd have an altar with a tabernacle, you'd have all the materials required for the priest to be able to conduct service. You would have the holy oil container, the chalice, practically to celebrate all the sacraments. We can add a bit, make some references.
We originally wanted to carry out the same exercise on the other side of the fold. So we're saying toleration and tolerance. No, toleration is tolerance with limits. It's not that I'm happy to have you here, but it's inevitable, so we make do with what we have. That's toleration. Tolerance is unconditional. In this case, we wanted to understand whether this tolerance was practiced also on the other side. So, Muslim captives in Christian lands, where they also allowed a certain degree of religious freedom, in the absence of plans and maps and documentary evidence that shows how North African banlieues were organized. We managed to find, on the other hand, maps and plans that show how Christian banlieues were organized. So in this case, we have the Bagno Grande di Livorno in Tuscany, right? An important maritime city, which served as the hub for the Order of St. Stephen. The Knights of St. Stephen were a Tuscan copy of the Knights of St. John of Malta. They also have the 8-pointed cross in red in their case. And as you can see, this is the original plan of the Bagno that no longer exists. It was brought down in Livorno. You can notice that in red, you have a Christian church, which is expected in a Christian Bagno, no? However, you have 3 tiny mosques as well. So even though naturally the church in the Bagno was much bigger, and of course it served for the jailers, for the Christian soldiers that were serving as jailers in the Bagno, each dormitory, these are dormitories, each dormitory for slaves had its tiny mosque. There was, however, a problem that we faced. In Islam, the role of religious materiality is much less central than it is for Christianity, specifically for Catholicism. As Maria mentioned, for us to celebrate the liturgy, the sacraments, you need objects. You need a chalice, you need a holy oil container. For baptism, you need the baptismal font. I mean, it's very material. In Islam, a mosque would have carpets, books, lamps, mostly, some sort of light fixtures. You don't have paintings, you don't have statues in a mosque, typically. So you couldn't really compare the materiality. However, in terms of tolerance, we know that this idea of having religious freedom, between inverted commas, with its limitation, was practiced on both sides.
So I wanted to envision also that plan, because we can say that it was quite similar in the case of North African bagnos. You would have the dormitories, the sleeping quarters all around. You would have the sahena, the courtyard in the middle, and then designated prayer spaces for, in this case, Christian captives. With reference to the Propaganda Fide, the Catholic Church set up proper missions, so they used to send missionaries, as my colleague explained, to visit the Barbary states, in most cases entrusted to Franciscan orders. So we had Capuchins, Trinitarians, Mercedarians, who would be reflecting on these 3 mainly. And these religious orders frequently sent reports to the Propaganda Fide on the state of the religious practices within the North African slave bagnos. The situation was often described as adequate. This implies that they had enough religious materiality to practice, as we were saying, these liturgical sermons and mass. That implies that most of the material, such as a pyx or a ciborium, would be made in such a way that you would also have precious metals used. You know, for the object to touch the particular, it had to be lined in gilt or gold. And here we discuss some examples. From the Habs Ara in Meknes, the church is described to have been decorated with draperies made out of paper, which mimicked damask as well. We also have reference to crosses, banners and flags, like the case study we shared in the beginning. And during the processions, the sacrament was often covered by a pallium made out of white damask. during Holy Week in the Algerian 𝐷𝐼𝐻, that was quite evocative. In fact, we have accounts which say that the Muslims, to a certain extent, were not partaking, but they were viewers, they were spectators, and they almost were in awe when these Christians carried out these celebrations, specifically during Holy Week, because the Christians practiced self-flagellation on Fridays, which was a huge contrast. In the descriptive account by Father Monroy, there are several material elements mentioned, such as the altar of repose, to show an example, and also we have the Maundy Thursday, we have it all set up. During Palm Sunday, they used to conduct a whole procession in the Sahana, which would have been decorated with flowers and also herbs. And during Good Friday specifically, a procession was held, this is a quotation, with a cross of silver-plated wood, a banner with the arms of the king, and the pallium of our order, Trinitarian. Some of the captives carried the monuments, 𝐷𝐼𝐻, while the others walked with candles in their hand, chanting, and the cleric carried the censer or a turban. And the alms that the captive gave were often used to make the monuments more decorated, more sumptuous. One consisted of 20 columns with arches which were embellished with linen, and they had more than 100 lights. And they were very long, so this also makes us, what comes to mind are the Spanish monuments, which during the Semana Santa in Spain, you can kind of visualize that type of monument, that particular vara. So this question perhaps you might have been asking is, how did these captives manage to collect enough money to fund all this religious materiality? Some of the donations came from the jailers themselves. Once again, the jailers wanted the slaves to remain docile, so sometimes they gave them offcuts, some materials which they could repurpose and reutilize in the church, in the churches. The slaves could also earn a small salary, so they could perform extra duties for their masters. Generally, this extra salary was saved up to eventually ransom themselves. However, they also found that they could donate it to the church. Like this, the church could buy more religious objects. We also know that the slaves who kept a prison tavern within the 𝐷𝐼𝐻 complex had to pay a fee, kind of a tax called dobla, for every sack of wine sold. This also went to the church. They also had confraternities within the 𝐷𝐼𝐻 complex, and the slaves could join in, and they had to pay a membership fee. Redemptionist orders and ambassadors often gave objects for liturgical ceremonies as well. Finally, we'd like to...
Okay, so we presented quite a paradox. Now we're saying that this is a situation of extreme hardship. At the same time, certain instances, particularly these religious celebrations, they give the impression that life went on. How could these individuals, so there is no clear answer to this, because none of them are alive, so we're trying to use our rationalism or our thoughts to understand how we have this paradox, how you could go to work in the morning and then self-flagellate in the evening, for instance, how you could work a lot to earn some money for your redemption, but at the same time use that very same amount of money to buy stuff for the church, prolonging your years in captivity. So one possible explanation to this apparent paradox lies in Christian theology. This idea, this Christian catechesis that places the onus of redemption of the soul on suffering. To keep in mind that life is part of the story. There is the eternal aspect. So these people truly believed that the redemption, most important, was not the redemption of the body, but the redemption of the soul. The fact that once they died, they would go to heaven. It was much more important than returning home. It's not to say that they don't want to go home. It's to say that they wanted their suffering to serve a purpose, not to be useless, needless suffering. Alright? They would therefore be more willing to endure physical hardships as a means of remission for their sins. They are believing that somehow this suffering that they are going through will serve a higher goal, a higher purpose. And this idea that by going through this suffering, they are emulating Christ. I take you back to the idea of 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿. Christ who went through all this before them, and somehow they are imitating Christ. It's not an original idea for the early modern period. This idea of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, is already present in the medieval period. The whole notion that for you to achieve salvation, you need to be as close to Christ as possible. Not only in your words and action, but partially also in your suffering. It is a very complex and very difficult to explain theological notion, especially for people who do not correspond to the Christian beliefs. However, they also represented the same idea visually. So in conclusion, we will show you this representation, which comes all the way from Guatemala, so South America. It is the apotheosis of the Mercedarian order, one of these orders that I mentioned, and it is essentially showing what I just said, this idea of emulating Christ. Let's read it together, because this is a painting that needs to be read rather than seen. In the middle, okay, first thing that captures your eye is Christ on the cross. The cross is covered in vines. So this idea of Christ the vine,
representing the Eucharist.
Representing the Eucharist, naturally. Alright? Blood from Christ is hitting first the Virgin Mary. So this idea of alter Christus, the imitation of Christ, being another Christ. So the Virgin Mary is partaking in all the suffering of Christ. Naturally, his mother was beneath the cross, so she went through all the suffering that he had gone through when he was on the cross. She was suffering for him and with him. Right? So his blood is hitting her heart and ending up in this common pool, which is representing the fountain of salvation. Right? Naturally, it's not just blood, it is the blood of Christ, which is another representation to the Eucharist. So when partaking in the Eucharistic celebrations, which as we explained continued on in the baños, people were drinking from the fountain of salvation. Every time they received the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, they were drinking and eating from the fountain, from the source of salvation, which is Christ. Then the painting is symmetrical. We have two Peters. Saint Peter Nolasco, who is the founder of the Mercedarian order, and Saint Peter the Apostle, the first Pope, who those of you who have been to Rome know that there is a particular dedication to San Pietro in Vincoli, Saint Peter in chains. The story of Saint Peter includes also an episode when he was held as a captive and an angel freed him. Right? So we have this symmetrical representation. Behind them is the source of the suffering. Two Ottoman baños. We're in Guatemala, they've never seen an Ottoman, but they are representing suffering and slavery by means of an Ottoman baño specifically. There were other forms of slavery in Guatemala, however, in the popular imagination, the captor, the other, the enemy, is always Muslim. Down here, you have, in the middle, of course, slaves all over, right? Some saints, Saint Michael, who is the protector, the defender. Down here you have Saint Raphael, representing healing, the process of healing. Not just physical healing, but even psychological healing. Keep in mind when these people, those of them who managed to return home, would return home traumatized. Right? It's something that would stay with them forever. We would call it PTSD nowadays, no post-traumatic stress. We have an instance of a Knight of Malta from Venice who was taken into slavery. He was eventually redeemed and kept his shackles and hung them above the mantelpiece. So every day he would see these shackles, reminding him of his trauma. It was his way of processing, I guess. So Saint Raphael here is representing this aspect of healing. spiritual, physical, psychological. Down here we have the angel with the broken chains. The fact that eventually, especially with death, this slavery, this suffering will be over. Okay? And the broken chains represent that in some way or another you will be set free. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. We have some time for questions if there are any.
Sorry, I had a question. Was there cases of exchange of prisoners at that time?
Yes, definitely.
There was.
So one way of redeeming slaves, naturally we're talking about captives, the higher ranking ones, so important ones, would be an exchange. We call them captives. Nowadays, perhaps a term which would be closer would be prisoners of war, because they are prisoners in this perennial war between the two big religions present in the Mediterranean, who are at perpetual war with each other, so they're always fighting. And these individuals are sort of collateral prisoners of war, be they civilian, but also military. Typically in an exchange, you would exchange important people, like military personnel, for instance, on both sides. You wouldn't exchange a commoner.
So there are records of...
Yes, definitely. Yes.
Sorry.
In your research, did you came across information about Gozitans who were taken captives in the Great Siege of Gozo of 1551?
No. Unfortunately, that is a huge lacuna we have. Sometimes the sources don't even specify where these individuals came from. They would say 𝐑𝐞𝐥𝐢𝐸 Maltese, which includes Gozitans as well, in a generic sense. In the 18th century, we start finding references to, like that guy from 𝐂𝐴𝐸𝐸, to where they're pinpointing where. But otherwise, especially for the religious orders that are documenting the list of people who are in captivity, you saw the source of that Franciscan observant who's saying, we keep lists of these individuals. For them, 𝐂𝐴𝐸𝐸, Valletta, Victoria Gozo, not Victoria back then, but Rabadolo. It's all the same, Maltese. It's already a lot that they say Maltese. So unfortunately, from the sources, we can't always get the information that we want. We have no idea what happened to those people after they left. And part of the reason why we wanted to study this topic is that in a way we are shedding light on individuals who were not considered very important historiographically. These are not grandmasters. We know about the years that the Vallet spent in slavery, but we don't know when 𝐶𝐴𝐵𝐵𝐺 was in slavery, because 𝐶𝐴𝐵𝐵𝐺 was 𝐶𝐴𝐵𝐵𝐺 and nobody really cared for 𝐶𝐴𝐵𝐵𝐺. So this is what we call micro-history. The history that is focusing on a particular place at a particular point in time, giving a snapshot of common people, whoever they could be, with people who are important, like Jeronimo Gracian, who wrote about their experience because they were erudite and all that. We get a lot of information, however, about the commoners. We don't even know whether all of them managed to reach Malta after they were redeemed. So the lists show that in the 18th century, for instance, less than one slave a year managed to return home in the archives of the Confraternity of Charity. So these are the individuals who are asking money from the Confraternity of Charity. They are setting money aside for their redemption. Most of them can't access it because they never make it home. Even if they somehow manage to escape or get out, they never reach home.
What you just said, a question I had, but I wasn't going to ask. Could it be possible that they organized and they had religious ceremonies, etc., because they had come to the conclusion that they would never leave the prison complex, and so they would have said rather, okay, there was always the possibility of emulating Christ, etc., but could it also be brought about by a feeling, knowing they were unable, probably never going back home, that this is it, so let's make it work?
And naturally, when we're talking about them, we're talking about hundreds of individuals over a span of a century and a half, the span of these documents even more. So you get those who were more optimistic and those who were less optimistic, those who had means and those who didn't have the means. Cervantes himself tried to escape 4 times before he was ransomed eventually. So those who had fight or flight, no, those who wanted to escape and try and do something about it, and those who were more resigned. The religious celebrations were done specifically because they were Catholic through and through. So we tend to think that the people of the past, yeah, they went to church, but it was habitual for them. They didn't really believe. We presume that we know their sentiment, their religious sentiment. Through sources like this, it emerges how they did things that for us would be irrational, completely irrational. I'm saying they're using money that they needed to eventually get out of captivity, spending it on a tabernacle, on a statue for Good Friday.
But my point is exactly, could it be they thought that getting out is impossible, so let us work on this because this is what we have at the end of our lives?
That they made a life of it, yes. That as a means of coping. Some of them even tried to switch sides, even. And at times were not allowed. So we have instances where a person goes to the Bey of Tripoli and he tells him, I want to convert to Islam. And he says no. And he goes again the following week, I want to convert to Islam. No. So that they tried to make the most of the situation is true for many people. That some of them were less optimistic and were more resigned, and that's why they made a life of it in captivity and continued on. That's true. The fact that they were allowed by their captors to do all that shows that at least the captors believed that keeping them busy, preparing for the next feast, and we have hundreds of feasts in the liturgical calendar, so there's always the feast, was a means to keep them docile, to keep them at bay, to keep them quiet. If you are busy preparing for Corpus Christi, you have no time to plan an escape. Right? Keep in mind that they're doing all this after a day's work. It's not a full-time job. A hard day's work. They're in the banyo, in the dark. This is an image, an actual image.
I will find it for you.
Of the banyo in Meknes.
Yep, sorry.
This is the banyo in Meknes. Forget about this is the altar of repose in the Prado. Just to give you an idea of what an altar of repose in the 17th century would look like. This is the actual banyo of Meknes, so underground tunnels. And this is where they were working on the decorations.
There are some.
They're being kept busy. They're being kept busy, that's what we know.
Were there suicides?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. As I said, even freed slaves at times couldn't make it home, let alone the ones still in captivity. What we didn't mention was that being a Christian in Muslim territory did not always mean that you were a slave. Okay? There were Christians, even Maltese, possibly even Cositans, who went to North Africa to work for trade. Some of them were tailors, some of them were cobblers, without converting to Islam. Again, tolerance and toleration. I don't know if I answered as best as I could. Naturally, we can't be in their minds and in their hearts, especially these people who the majority of them would have been possibly illiterate, and they never left a testament of their experience. We don't really know. We're trying to reconstruct what we know about them through, in this case, the religious practices. We can take other angles to study these individuals. We chose this particular one.
We are understanding that all slaves were men. What about the women?
No, not all slaves were men, in fact. I might have given that impression, but slaves were both men and women. Predominantly male, for the simple reason that many of them, as I said, were prisoners of war, so corsairs captured on galleys in the Mediterranean, or soldiers. So they would have been men. However, with the example I've taken of Media, the 1681 attack on Media, they captured the whole population, men, women and children. Children were the first to be ransomed. So when the Mercenarian orders got to the bagnios, so they had a special permission as free folk, basically, to roam about in these Muslim cities, to meet the slaves. Some of them celebrated the liturgy for them, even though they always had priests, captive priests. So priests who were on galleys and were taking slaves with the rest. And the Mercenarians celebrated liturgy for them as well, and they would start pinpointing those individuals who were either close to apostatizing, let's get them out before they switch religions, or the vulnerable, women and children first. Right? So we know that they tried to redeem. Professor Franz Chappara wrote also a paper on the fluidity of the divide between Christianity and Islam in the Mediterranean, focusing mostly on the 18th century. And he gives concrete example, let's call them children, but the Confraternity of Charity, for instance, in the 18th century once redeemed a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. So we have examples, yes.
Now perhaps we can add that as part of the women's slaves, perhaps that is also a big lacuna, you can imagine perhaps why, but we do have written texts that explain that once the slaves were captured, they were at times taken at the slave market, and when they were buying the slaves, they would decide, for example, female slaves would have been used in domestic settings, correct?
So not necessarily in the bagnios.
Not necessarily
So
in
the
the
bagnios, in a particular city like Algiers, you had 7 or 8 bagnios, the state ones and private ones. So if I am a rich North African corsair, and I typically take slaves in my various voyages, I might have my own private bagnio, or else pay the state to keep my slaves against a fee. When they arrive in the city, and they are being, as I said, selected, and Maria is explaining also, the fact that, for instance, they check their hands to see if they were able-bodied or not, if they worked with their hands. Like, I wouldn't count.
They
for
generally
instance.
used to undress them, to have a look.
Undress them, check their feet and all that. Women were typically sold off in the countryside. So wealthy people in the countryside with their palaces and villas and whatever, to work as domestics and nannies. So you wouldn't really find a lot of women in the bagnio, but you had instances, yes.
I'm sure there were people taken as slaves before the Knights came to Malta.
For sure, yes.
So were there these confraternities and things which were there before?
So the problem with confraternities is that they appeared in Malta mostly in the 16th century. Right? It's a counter-reformation creation. It's not that there are no medieval confraternities. We have several documented, say, in the big Christian cities. So Rome, Florence, they had confraternities even in the medieval period. In Malta, we don't have record of them. Keep in mind that one of the limitations of the study that we presented was the fact that we are using textual sources. So if we had a confraternity but they don't have archives, or we don't have record of medieval confraternities, what they did and how they spent their money, we can't really know concretely. However, slavery, as I said, is something perennial, And we know that Maltese had been corsairs, so certain Michele da Malta, for instance, had been attacking the Knights of St. John whilst they were still in Rhodes. So even before the Knights came, we had Maltese corsairs, for sure, in the medieval period. And if we had Maltese corsairs, we had the Maltese slaves, 100%.
It is an old fact that in the 1400s, also during the reign of Frederick II, there was a community of Muslims in Gozo, in water. And then Frederick II did not tolerate it anymore, and they converted to Christianity. So,
1400s, Frederick II, before. Before. Alphonse V, or Martin I.
Frederick II, after
Frederick II.
before Roman kings.
Before the 1400s. Yes, we had Muslim communities.
There were Muslim communities, and even Jewish communities.
Yes, the Jewish communities were expelled from Malta in the 1490s, originally from 1492, with the consolidation of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon in Spain and the capture of Granada in the 1490s. An edict was sent out. Malta was Spanish, right? So an edict was sent out that all Jews would be expelled, and we had Jewish communities, and they were gradually expelled.
Malta was Aragonese after Frederick II.
Of course, it was Aragonese eventually.
There was Charles of Anjou in between.
Yes. The Angevins came before the Aragonese.
Yes.
Yes, but with the unification of the Spanish territories,
Yes.
and especially from Charles V onwards, who is uniting all the crowns into one, and he's an heir to a mega empire. Yes, the presence of these communities. With the Muslim communities, they were expelled to Lucera, southern Italy. So we know that they had, however, we had those who did not want to convert. However, we had Muslim communities in Malta, slave communities. So in Malta we had at least 3 slave bagnios in the Grand Harbour. So Valletta had its bagno where the lower Baracca is. It doesn't exist anymore, next to St. Ursula and St. Christopher Street, with its own mosque. And we know of the rebellion of the slaves in the 1700s, etc. There was another bagno in Birgu and another one in Senglea, so at least 3 bagnos. The number of slaves in Malta ranges anywhere from 5,000 to a few hundred. So eventually, and it's something we see also on the other side, the number of slaves, even in North Africa, gradually diminishes in the 18th century, which is a result of the fact that slowly Mediterranean warfare was moving away from galley warfare. They're not using galleys anymore, they're using ships of the line. So privateering is slowly declining, and the number of captives in this case needed, rowers, was much less. However, we had Muslim communities in Malta in captivity, in captivity. One last question?
Yeah.
We'll take one last question and conclude.
Yeah, I'd like to know what you do also with, for example, more the folklore side of the Bride of Mostar, because that is an old story. It is a ballade, so it is made most
Ar-Hassan, San Dimitri here in Gozo.
Yeah, and
So-
all kind of things, yeah.
So these, let's call them legends, these stories, represent the concept of the other, the fear that the population had of the other, and how important for them was the concept of being saved by the divine. Because if something happens in the extreme that you are taken slave, or almost taken slave, at some point it's only God that can help you. So again, faith. Most of these legends, most of these stories represent either a saint or the Virgin Mary. And it's very, as we mentioned also in the case of Our Lady of Freedom, the fact that there was a cult towards Our Lady of Freedom that now exists no more because we're no longer afraid of being taken into slavery. Again, it shows how faith ties in with the idea of captivity, that at some point only God can save you, only the Virgin Mary can save you. And these stories impart specifically that message. I don't know if I have answered. It shows how common it was for them as well, how captivity was an everyday occurrence. You heard every day, he was taken slave, miskin. Sort of, it was something very common, something that was considered a possibility by the entire population. You didn't say, no, it will never happen to me.